Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Dirk Braunstein's Adorno's Critique of Political Economy. Chapter 4 is titled Familiarity with its first chapter. And it starts with a quote. It looks like it's a passage from something by a Tierno Monenembo. It seems like a piece of dialogue. I've already been to Bijan. You weren't even born, you fetus. Fetishist! Exclamation point. Fake. You use expressions without knowing what they mean. Give up, Falstaff. Section 1. A music that has become incomprehensible. In 1936, the Zeitschrift for Sozialforschung published On Jazz, an essay written by Adorno under the pseudonym of Hector Rottweiler. Situating this text within the ongoing debate initiated by the article The Work of Art and the Age of its Technological Reproducibility, Adorno describes it in a letter to Benjamin as extremely closely related to the latter's own article, even going so far as to, quote, insist that the entire conception of my essay, goes back to a time before I became acquainted with your work, end quote. Adorno to Benjamin, 28th of May, 1936. Benjamin in turn attributes their independently originating engagements with a similar topic to, quote, a profound and spontaneous inner communication between our thoughts, end quote, causing their respective investigations to be, quote, like two different lampheads trained upon the same object from opposite directions, end quote. Benjamin to Adorno, 30th of June, 1936. Yet to use Benjamin's metaphor, Adorno's contribution appears to cast a decidedly brighter light on the object in question. Regarding Benjamin's, quote, masochism in the Work of Art article, an issue discussed in the previous chapter of this study, Adorno writes the following to Horkheimer, quote, the Parisian brothel, Sphinx, is a more appropriate place for masochism than Marx's theory. Same goes for the professorially romantic notions of technology. It really does have something of a Wandervogel, gone insane, and Benjamin has long failed to emancipate himself from Brecht. But as a basis for discussion, the work is very useful in spite of everything. It must absolutely be published, of course. My jazz essay should already contain some correctives, end quote. Footnote, translator's note. Here, Wandervogel, an antiquated word for, quote, migratory bird, denotes a member of an early 20th century German youth movement, die Wandervogelbewegung, which romanticized nature and folk culture. End footnote. And the quote was from a letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 21st of March, 1936. Adorno acknowledges several inadequacies of On Jazz at various places in his writings. In a 1959 letter to the music critic Baldur Bachhoff, Adorno admits that the essay, quote, indeed has the flaw that the decisive American experiences are still not processed in it, and is in more than one respect primitive, yet contains the core of certain categories which are implicitly required by the later work you are familiar with from Prisms, end quote. Adorno to Bachhoff, 29th of September 1959. Footnote. The work to which Adorno is referring is the essay titled Perennial Fashion, Jazz, which was first published in 1953 before being republished in the essay collection Prisms in 1955. In his extensive study on the significance of jazz for Adorno, Heinz Steinert concludes that Adorno informed himself about jazz while in the United States, quote, mainly by listening to the radio and reading two books, end quote. Steinert, 2003. End footnote. Subsequently, in his 1964 Moment Musicale, I don't know. A collection of essays on music in which On Jazz is republished, Adorno confesses a, quote, insufficient knowledge of the specifically American aspects of jazz, especially that of standardization, end quote, while noting, quote, the obsolescence of some characteristics of European jazz in the 1930s, end quote. Adorno. That being said, shortly after composing On Jazz, Adorno locates the essay's, quote, primary flaw, end quote, elsewhere, namely, in the essay's lack of, quote, concrete economic categories, end quote. A lack Adorno nevertheless, quote, neither could nor wanted to paper over, end quote. Footnote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 26th of January 1936. Adorno makes a quite similar claim in his lecture course, Fragen der Dialektik, Questions of Dialectics. Quote, now in the little booklet, Moment Musique, one can find a work on jazz which is now almost 30 years old, yet nevertheless very programmatic for me. This work, partially due to the fact that it was written in Europe before I had lived in America, has a certain ignorance of its material, is disputable in its premise, so to speak, and I absolutely would not want to defend its substance or put myself on the line for every sentence it contains, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. This flaw is evident in the editorial revisions made to Adorno's manuscript by Horkheimer and Friedrich Pollock. In one passage, Adorno does in fact employ the concept of surplus value. While innovation sometimes, quote, leads to a piece's great success, end quote, he writes, such pieces are, quote, mostly pressed against the will of the publishers as they involve a clear risk. And then it says, surplus value prevails against the entrepreneur with a line through it, end quote. Footnote, cited from editorial note by Tiedemann. For the final English version of the sentence, see Adorno 2019, end footnote. However, as the strike-through in the above quotation from the edited manuscript indicates, the final clause was removed in the editorial process, with even Adorno acknowledging that his own, quote, formulation was awkward in its economic inexactitude, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 26th of May, 1936. Elsewhere, Adorno's use of Marxian terminology was refined by the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung. For example, one sentence from the manuscript reads, quote, jazz is a commodity in the strict sense. In musical production, jazz's suitability for everyday use establishes itself in no other form than its exchange value, its saleability, end quote. With its exchange value striked out. Regarding the replacement of the Marxian, quote, exchange value, end quote, with, quote, saleability, end quote, Absatzfähigkeit, Horkheimer remarks that Pollock is, quote, of the opinion that the concept of, quote, exchange value belongs on another theoretical level as that on which it is used in the essay. This passage could thus give the impression of mere, quote, coquetry, end quote, with Marxian terminology, which at any rate should be avoided, end quote. Horkheimer to Adorno, 15th of June, 1936. Several years prior to 1932, the first issue of the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung published a two-part essay by Adorno titled On the Social Situation of Music. The piece can be regarded as a kind of precursor to the essay on jazz in many respects, including in its use of economic categories. Already within it, Adorno identifies the, quote, role of music in the social process, end quote, as, quote, exclusively that of a commodity. Its value is that determined by the market. Music no longer serves direct needs nor benefits from direct application, but rather adjusts to the pressures of the exchange of abstract units. Music's value, wherever such value still exists at all, is determined by use. Music subordinates itself to the process of exchange, end quote. Adorno. In this passage, Adorno evidently still believes that there could potentially be commodities for which use value no longer in fact, quote, still exists at all, end quote. However, Adorno also asserts that, quote, through total absorption of both musical production and consumption by the capitalist process, the alienation of music from man has been complete, end quote. Adorno. According to Adorno, for music to, quote, intervene in the social process, end quote, music has to be, quote, in a position to intervene as art, end quote. Adorno. Yet for music to be able to intervene as art in the first place, music cannot be counterposed to society as, quote, a, quote, spiritual, end quote, phenomenon, abstract and far removed from actual social conditions, end quote. Adorno. This would result in nothing more than a, quote, sanction of the fetish character of music, which is the major difficulty and most basic problem to be represented by music today, end quote. Adorno. Thus, there emerges for Adorno the problem of how music and society can be theoretically mediated. Quote, the short circuit, such music is incomprehensible, esoteric, private, thus reactionary, and must, therefore, be rejected. Such music is constructed upon the foundation of a romantic concept of primitive musical immediacy, which gives rise to the opinion that the empirical consciousness of present-day society, a consciousness promoted in unenlightened narrow-mindedness, and indeed promoted even to the point of neurotic stupidity, in the face of class domination, for the purpose of the preservation of this consciousness, might be taken as the positive measure of a music no longer alienated, but rather the property of free men. Politics must not be permitted to draw abstractions from this state of consciousness, which is necessarily of central concern to the social dialectic, nor is cognition to allow the definition of its boundaries by a consciousness produced by class domination, and which further, as the class consciousness of the proletariat, extends the wounds of mutilation by means of the class mechanism, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, was an essential component of the materialist conception of history not being finally abandoned here, with only the concept of a mechanics of the development of productive forces and productive relations remaining. In none of the articles did the expression, quote, monopoly capitalism, end quote, occur as often as in Adorno's. Adorno even saw, quote, fascism, as he called it, he was the only one to mention it at all, as being controlled by monopoly capitalists in accordance with the communist dogma of the time. This gave the impression that, by declaring his belief in the key concepts and thought processes of dogmatic Marxism, Adorno was trying to create a favorable climate for his own interpretation of modern music, for himself and for the left, from which Adorno most expected sympathy for the new music, end quote. Viggershaus. End footnote. In a letter written after receiving the article on the social situation of music, directly from Adorno himself, Ernst Krenek responds by criticizing the essay's central thesis, quote, that music first assumed a commodity character in the capitalist world, end quote. For Krenek, the true novelty of music under capitalism lies in the fact that, quote, music, like all art, has become autonomous. The place where music is consumed and paid for no longer exists, because music no longer desires to conform to existing needs, ... Yet as the autonomous composer still wishes to live off the income from his work, that which we call isolation emerges, ... Certainly the autonomization of art can be explained from social transformations. However, capitalism did not turn art into a commodity, rather at most transformed humans in such a way that humans no longer desire the commodity which music always already was. and which had once been gladly purchased. If we judge a humanity interested in this commodity more highly than one which is disinterested, which is something I am willing to do, then we have delivered a verdict on the capitalist world. It has destroyed human dignity by exorcising from man the wish for spiritual goods. By this, I do not intend any criticism of these goods themselves, and on this point I do not understand, for example, Benjamin's polemic against the, quote, creative, end quote. End quote. Krennic. Letter from Krennic to Adorno, 11th of September, 1932. End footnote. In the final sentence of this passage, Ernst Krennic refers to a review by Benjamin from the same year which takes issue with the concepts of the, quote, creative and the, quote, productive, although Benjamin views these concepts as, quote, by nature nothing other than the expression of humane relationships between humans, end quote. He also argues that they are, quote, to the degree that they have died in the life of the community, reified, emblems on private man, to want to place, an already by definition amorphous mass of private people at the helm politically, in a parliament of intellectuals, for example, is outright quixotism. Today it may still be amiable, but by tomorrow it could be harmful, end quote. Benjamin. In a response letter of his own, Adorno clarifies to Krennic that, quote, music does not take on the character of a commodity because music is exchanged in general, but rather because music is exchanged abstractly, in the sense of the commodity form explicated by Marx, which is to say that instead of an immediate relation of exchange taking place, a, quote, reified, end quote, one occurs instead. When you identify art's, quote, autonomization, end quote, as the decisive transformation, this is in reality nothing other than what I mean by commodity character. It is just the same phenomenon described not from the perspective of the relations of production, but rather from that of the forces of production. This, of course, can be done. It is just not the subject of my work. Just as with the musician, the positive element of autonomization is what I have accentuated here as well. If one understands capitalism not merely as, quote, pro-money, end quote, but namely as the totality of a social process defined by abstract labor time as a unit of exchange, then capitalism has, in a precise sense, most certainly made art into a commodity, along with man. The commodity character of art as the objective side of this process, and the destruction of, quote, human dignity, end quote, as its subjective side, are equivalent and cannot be wrested free from each other. And if Benjamin attacked, quote, creative man, Benjamin did so because the pathos of, quote, spirit does not strengthen the true pathos opposed to the reified state of humans and objects, but rather obscures this state by presenting an illusory provisional possibility, one that is merely subjective, in fact, and undialectical, as sufficient for overcoming it. In other words, Benjamin attacked, quote, creative man because, quote, creative man regards the world precisely in a, quote, bourgeois manner, as produced by spirit and correctable through spirit, whereas world and spirit are intertwined with each other, and the corrective can only be surmised in world and spirit's dialectic, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Krennic, 30th of September, 1932. Footnote. On the, quote, positive element of autonomization, end quote, Adorno had previously written that, quote, the autonomy of art itself, through which art opposes the machinery, is according to art's innermost sense already the negation of fossilized relations. Whoever therefore blurs the boundary of the aesthetic realm into contemporary practice levels it to this practice and thus to the prevailing reification, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. In the article on jazz, Adorno subsequently turns towards exposing, quote, the subject of jazz as eccentricity and sham opponent, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 31st of January 1936. Quote, written on a double defensive, first against jazz's music, yet even more so against jazz's positive appraisal, against, quote, jazz ideology, end quote. End quote. Fallbush, 2006. The phrase, quote, jazz ideology, end quote, appears in Adorno 2018 page 96, end footnote. The essay argues that jazz is, quote, pseudo-democratic, end quote, because jazz's, quote, attitude of immediacy, hides class differences, end quote. Listeners are given what listeners desire, but at the same time, listeners' desire is merely satisfied. In turn, this desire has already been shaped in advance by what is on offer. Quote, the irresistible propaganda machine belabors the masses with the songs it likes, which are usually the bad songs, until their tired memory is defenseless and at their mercy, and this fatigue of the memory in turn affects further production, end quote. Adorno. And despite the lack of strict economic categories, Adorno does define the functionality of jazz from an economic perspective as well. Quote, jazz is a commodity in the strict sense, end quote, Adorno writes. Quote, in musical production, jazz's suitability for everyday uses establishes itself in no other form than its salability, which stands in the most extreme opposition not only to the immediacy of its use, but also to that of the work process itself. It is subject to the rules as well as the arbitrariness of the market, just as its distribution is subject to those of competition or even its air, end quote. Adorno. Anticipating a topos of critique of the culture industry, a concept which was lacking in 1936, Adorno describes jazz as Gebrauchsmusik, or use music. That is, music which takes on the character of a commodity due to its mode of production, thereby acquiescing to the status quo. Given jazz's function in upholding the status quo, jazz fosters alienation, which Adorno believes jazz must nevertheless, quote, cloak, along with jazz's commodity character, in order not to jeopardize, quote, jazz's own success on the market, end quote. Adorno. In seemingly direct opposition to Benjamin's work of art essay and its hope for an emancipatory mass-produced art, Adorno issues his verdict against jazz's capacity to subordinate itself to utilitarian ends. Quote, for if, as has often been the case, one wished to view the usability of jazz's suitability as a mass item, as a dialectically advanced corrective of the bourgeois isolation of autonomous art, and even to accept its usability as a motive for the abolition of music's object character, one would be lapsing into the latest form of romanticism, which desperately seeks to escape the fatal character of capitalism by affirming the object of fear itself as some ghastly allegory of imminent freedom, and by sanctifying negativity, a sanctity in which, incidentally, jazz would like to make us believe. Whatever the situation of art might be in a future order of things, whether art's autonomy and rarity will survive or not, and the economic perspective supplies various reasons why the right form of society will not be centered on the creation of pure immediacy, this much is certain: the usability of jazz does not negate alienation, but rather reinforces alienation. End quote. Adorno. Adorno views the variety of avant-garde musical currents collectively referred to as Neue Musik as a model for emancipatory art. In contrast, while listeners may initially turn towards jazz in search of such a model, it is precisely this of which they are defrauded. Quote, whoever flees to jazz from a music that has become incomprehensible, or from the alienation of everyday life, becomes caught up in a system of musical commodities whose only advantage compared with others is that of not being immediately transparent, but which, in its decisive aspects, namely the unimprovised ones, crushes precisely those hopes for humanity with which the fugitive comes to it. With jazz, powerless subjectivity leaps from the world of commodities into the world of commodities. The system permits no escape, end quote. Adorno. After all, Adorno argues, jazz's commodity character demands that jazz conform to the rule that, quote, an element of the market is as good as one of myth. Jazz must therefore always be the same, while always feigning novelty, end quote. Adorno. One second. God damn it. Sorry about that. New section, torn away from all functions. In 1938, the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung published Adorno's essay titled On the Fetish Character in Music and the Regression of Listening. A revised version was included in his 1956 essay collection Dissonanzen, Musik in der verwalteten Welt, which translates as Dissonances, Music in the Administered World. In a letter to Benjamin, Adorno describes the piece as, quote, a kind of counterpart, end quote, to the essay on jazz, which had appeared 2 years earlier. Although he had arrived at the idea for a work on the fetish character in music as early as 1936, the realization of this plan was initially delayed on account of timing. Quote, publishing an essay on music and the fetish character now, so soon after the jazz essay, don't seem appropriate to me, end quote. Horkheimer comments in a letter from the time. Not until 1938 does Adorno mention his idea to Krakauer, quote, in connection with the Wagner, I have been reading a great deal of Schopenhauer with considerable interest. I am thinking of writing something about the general regression in listening and the characteristics of fetishism in music, end quote. Adorno to Krakauer, 3rd of May, 1938. Footnote. Schopenhauer famously describes music thusly, quote, in fact, music is an unmediated objectivation and copy of the entire will, just as the world itself is, just as in fact the ideas themselves are, whose multiplied appearance constitutes the world of particular things. Therefore, unlike the other arts, music is in no way a copy of the ideas. Instead, music is a copy of the will itself, whose objecthood the ideas are as well. This is precisely why the effect of music is so much more powerful and urgent than that of the other arts. The other arts speak only of shadows, while music speaks of the essence. End quote. Schopenhauer. Adorno refers to this passage in his 1958 essay titled Some Ideas on the Sociology of Music. Quote, by virtue of its basic material, music is the art in which the pre-rational mimetic impulses ineluctably find their voice, even as they enter into a pact with the processes leading to the progressive domination of matter and nature. This is the material to which music owes music's ability to transcend the business of mere self-preservation, an ability that led Schopenhauer to define music as the immediate objectification of the will and to place it at the apex of the hierarchy of the arts, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Here Adorno is referring to his book-length essay titled In Search of Wagner, written, quote, between autumn 1937 and spring 1938, end quote. This text clearly draws on Benjamin's understanding of phantasmagoria and fetish as expressed in the preliminary studies to the Arcades project. Quote, the property appertaining to the commodity as the commodity's fetish character, end quote, Benjamin writes, quote, attaches as well to the commodity-producing society, not as it is in itself, to be sure, but more as it represents itself and thinks to understand itself whenever it abstracts from the fact that it produces precisely commodities, end quote. Benjamin. Presumably following Marx's use of the concept, Benjamin seeks to convert the commodity's fetish character into an aesthetics of phantasmagoria, arguing that, quote, the creations and forms of life based above all on the production of commodities, are, quote, illuminated, end quote, not primarily ideologically, but by theorization. Not primarily ideologically by theorization, but rather sensuously by their immediate presence. They are manifest as phantasmagorias, end quote. Footnote. Translator's note. Braunstein here quotes from a 1939 version of Benjamin's expose to the Arcades project. Although a, quote, final version of the 1939 expose written in French has been translated into English, I've chosen to quote from the earlier version cited by Braunstein, given differences between the two versions, for an English translation of the equivalent passage in the, quote, final 1939 expose, see Benjamin 2002. End footnote. These so-called phantasmagorias are described as much not due to their, quote, economic and social function, but as an expression of collective space, end quote. Freitag. In Wagner, the Wagner book, or essay, Adorno further develops this interpretation of the concept of fetish. Quote, if we leave aside the dubious notion of, quote, truth in the artistic sense, end quote, and discard the category of interiorization as irrelevant to Wagner, the concept of illusion as the absolute reality of the unreal grows in importance. It sums up the unromantic side of the phantasmagoria. Phantasmagoria as the point at which aesthetic appearance becomes a function of the character of the commodity. As a commodity, it purveys illusions. The absolute reality of the unreal is nothing but the reality of a phenomenon that not only strives unceasingly to spirit away its own origins in human labor, but also, inseparably from this process and enthralled to exchange value, assiduously emphasizes its use value, stressing that this is its authentic reality, that it is, quote, no imitation, end quote, and all this in order to further the cause of exchange value. In Wagner's day, the consumer goods on display turned their phenomenal side seductively towards the mass of customers while diverting attention from their merely phenomenal character, from the fact that they were beyond reach, Similarly, in the Phantasmagoria, Wagner's operas tend to become commodities, end quote. Adorno. Here, it might be objected that by equating phantasmagoria with the desire for commodities whose origins in human labor are hidden, Adorno invokes a myth of authenticity while assigning commodities an appearance one-sidedly declared to be inauthentic. However, it appears possible that this problem is not lost on him. In a letter to Benjamin from the same year in which he composed Wagner, Adorno composed Wagner, the same letter in which he criticizes the first draft of Benjamin's Baudelaire essay, Adorno admits that, quote, the Phantasmagoria chapter of my book on Wagner has certainly not succeeded in resolving, bracket, the difficulty of commodity form analysis, end bracket, yet, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 10th of November, 1938. In the article on the social situation of music and the article on jazz, Adorno still evidently speaks a language received from Lukács and Benjamin. However, with the essay on the fetish character in music, Adorno claims to have treated, quote, the recent musical sociological observations I had made in America, end quote, with the help of distinctly Marxian categories. That is, Adorno claims to have remedied his observations' lack of, quote, concrete economic categories, end quote. Adorno apparently tackled the required reading for this undertaking only shortly beforehand. In a 1937 letter, Adorno writes to Benjamin that, quote, one of the first things I have planned to do is to undertake the systematic study of capital, end quote. Adorno, and one of the two copies of the first volume of Capital from his personal library bears the date 10th of June 1938, handwritten on its end paper. Adorno's experiences of music in the United States were first and foremost experiences of music on the radio. Shortly after arriving in his New York exile in late February 1938, Adorno began working on the Princeton Radio Research Project, headed by the Austrian émigré sociologist Paul F. Lazarsfeld. I don't know how to say his name properly. The goal of the project was to investigate, quote, the preferences and habits of American radio listeners, end quote. Fallbush, 2006. Quote, Benjamin's thesis that the mechanical reproduction of art would extract art treasures from the aura of their politically burdensome authority by demolishing their claim to being one of a kind, by annulling the spell they cast on their perpetually sacred distance, had been conceived exclusively in terms of print media and the visual arts, most of all cinema and photography. The music study of the Princeton Project, however, under Adorno's directorship, examined the claims of Benjamin's seminal essay with regard to the reproduction of music, and the results of this study illuminated it in an altogether new way. Adorno had observed in listening to radio music that the humanizing content of the music that he had spent his life composing, reflecting on, and studying had vanished. Radio music to Adorno's ears was no longer that music, end quote. Hlott Kenter, 2009. After all, the mass reproduction of what once carried the promise of universal happiness degrades the individual's aspiration for happiness. Quote, the man who in the subway triumphantly whistles loudly the theme of the finale of Brahms' First is already primarily involved with its debris, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Hlott Kenter writes that despite Benjamin's claim, reproduction had not, quote, made art music slough off its erratic, in the sense of like aura, cocoon. On the contrary, radio reproduction, Adorno would show, subjects the broadcast remnants of the artwork to a new spell. The remainder husk becomes a new fetish. Mechanical reproduction does not destroy the primacy of the original, as Benjamin asserted, but rather, mechanical reproduction changes music into nothing but the search for an original to be possessed, end quote. Hulot Kenter. While all emphatic originality is rendered anachronistic by the process of production, products still present themselves as if each were the latest novelty. End footnote. In a letter to the project's co-editors from around the same time, Lazarsfeld relates the following about his first impression of Adorno. Quote, Adorno looks exactly as you would imagine a very absent-minded German professor, and he behaves so foreign that I feel like a member of the Mayflower Society. When you start to talk to Adorno, however, Adorno has an enormous amount of interesting ideas. As every newcomer, Adorno tries to reform everything, but if you listen to Adorno, most of what he says makes sense, end quote. Lazarsfeld. I don't know how to say it. Looking back, Lazarsfeld notes the, quote, brilliance and importance of Adorno's ideas, end quote, when discussing a controversy surrounding the concept of fetishism. Quote, to straighten out the situation, I asked Adorno to summarize Adorno's ideas in a memorandum, which I plan to circulate among various experts to secure a broader base of support for his work. In June 1938, Adorno delivered a memorandum of 160 single-spaced pages titled Music in Radio. But it seems to me that the distribution of this text would only have made the situation more difficult, for in English his writing had the same tantalizing attraction and elusiveness that it had in German. The notion of, quote, fetish played, as could be expected from a neo-Marxist, a central role, end quote. Lazarsfeld. This retrospective account tends to read like the report of a productive encounter between two quite different theorists. However, the events surrounding the publication of the Fetish Character article in 1938 actually unfolded in a much more controversial and conflictual manner. This can be seen in a letter by Lazarsfeld, in which, having received the aforementioned memorandum, he accuses Adorno himself of the very fetishism he claims to recognize in others. Quote, don't you think that it is perfect fetishism the way you use Latin words all through your text? The pages are full of prima facie, e contrario, conditio sine qua non, and so on. There is no doubt that the words, quote, necessary condition, end quote, expresses everything which the corresponding Latin word can express. But you evidently feel magically more secure if you use words which symbolize your education, although they are trouble for any stenographer and a hidden offense against any American colleague. Just because American professionals are not brought up to use Latin words unnecessarily, we are not yet better than they are. Isn't your attitude exactly what you call fetishism? End quote. Letter from Lazarsfeld to Adorno, early September 1938. Evidently, Lazarsfeld, quote, had probably selected the person least likely to be of any plausible use to him in completing a study on improving radio reception, end quote. Hulot Kenter, 2009. And although he expresses hope in a subsequent letter that Adorno, quote, just has a queer way of behaving of which he might be cured, end quote, private communications from the, quote, very absent-minded German professor, end quote, show him is far less concerned with, quote, being cured, end quote, than with, quote, throwing in the towel, end quote. Parenthesis, den Bettel für die Füße zu werfen. On his collaboration with the, quote, nuisance, end quote, Plagergeist, Lazarsfeld. Their collaboration finally did end in autumn 1939. The fetish character article reflects both Adorno's experience of music on the radio as well as of concert performance in the United States and his predilection for the concept of fetishism. According to the film scholar Christoph Hesse, I have a piece by Christoph Hesse on this channel, the essay, quote, throws together, indeed remarkably, the Marxian concept of fetish and the Freudian one, end quote. Christoph Hesse, something which can be seen in its very title. Yet, while Hesse's claim may be true of the first version of the fetish character article, it is only partially true of the fetish character article's republication. In the original, Adorno refers a total of 18 times to the, quote, pleasure, end quote, parenthesis, lust, end parenthesis. He claims music, quote, the immediate manifestation of instinct and the locus of instinct's taming, end quote. Adorno offers listeners. Sorry, the quote was from Adorno and then it says offers listeners. Throughout its consideration of pleasure and instinct and of the natural somatic as the ultimate point of reference for music's reception, the piece evidently gestures towards a sociology of music based on the theoretical tools of psychoanalysis. Footnote, quote, we regard instinct as being the concept on the frontier line between the somatic and the mental, and seeing it the psychical representative of organic forces, end quote. Freud, end footnote. And when Adorno explicitly mentions the mediation implied by its title, Adorno does so by laconically stating that the, quote, counterpart to the fetishism of music is a regression of listening, end quote. Quote, regression is a, quote, purely descriptive, end quote, concept of the subjective psychological phenomenon of an individual, quote, return from a higher to a lower stage of development, end quote. End quote, Freud, end quote, Freud. In the original version of the fetish character essay from 1938, there is a clear interplay, what Hesse offhandedly refers to as a, quote, throwing together, end quote, between the Marxian and Freudian concepts of fetishism. It is precisely fetishism, Adorno writes in a 1937 letter to Erich Fromm, which is supposed to serve as the mediating element for converting the relationship between Marxian theory and psychoanalysis from one of analogy to one of genuine synthesis. Quote, I am increasingly convinced that the actual coincidence of Marx's theory and psychoanalysis does not lie in analogies such as that between superstructure and base versus ego and id, etc. Rather, the coincidence lies in the fetish character of commodities and in the fetishistic character of humans. I also believe that the methodological exposition between Marxism and psychoanalysis can first be maneuvered dialectically at the moment in which one manages to concretely prove that the economic fetish character is the rule of psychological fetishizations. Incidentally, this also implies tracing the economic fetish character back beyond capitalist society and potentially back to the prehistory in which the primordial facts of economic fetishization left their first inner human deposits, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Erich Fromm, 16th of November 1937. Psychoanalysis uses the concept of fetishism to describe the neurotic displacement of desire for a sexual object onto a part of the actual object, which thereby becomes fetishized as a psychopathology. Quote, the fetishist achieves sexual arousal and satisfaction by putting particular objects, that is, inanimate objects, parenthesis, such as pieces of clothing or shoes, and parenthesis, or even body parts, the foot, in the place of an entire love object, end quote. Mensos, 1984. For Marx, however, the fetish character of commodities, as well as of money and capital, describes the fact that the economic, that is, the social, form of value emerges in the guise of things whose value is not regarded as socially mediated. Such things appear as if they always had value in themselves. Their thoroughly social essence hides behind their material appearance. Quote, the mysterious character of the commodity form consists therefore simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves, as the socio-natural properties of these things. Hence it also reflects the social relationship of the producers to the sum total of labor as a social relation between objects, a relation which exists apart from and outside the producers. Through this substitution, the products of labor become commodities, sensuous things which are at the same time suprasensible or social, end quote. And there's a couple footnotes here. Footnote, quote, men are henceforth related to each other in their social process of production in a purely atomistic way. Men's own relations of production therefore assume a material shape which is independent of men's control and men's conscious individual action. This situation is manifested first by the fact that the products of men's labor universally take on the form of commodities. The riddle of the money fetish is therefore the riddle of the commodity fetish, now become visible and dazzling to our eyes, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote. As Marx claims with critical distance, quote, capital is conceived as a thing, not as a relation, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote. In Adorno's copy of Capital, this passage is marked by an X as beginning and its end respectively. It is underlined 5 times, and in quote FF, end quote, for fortissimo is written in the margin. On the meanings of this marginalia, see Tiedemann, 1994. End footnote. At the same time, this also means that fetish character in the Marxian sense can only be spoken of in a society in which the commodity form dominates the entirety of production, that is, in a capitalist society. In other words, Adorno's description of Adorno's program to Fromm as, quote, tracing the economic fetish character back beyond capitalist society, end quote, is a contradiction in terms, as Marxian fetish character cannot grasp pre-capitalist modes of production. In his letter to Fromm and in his fetish character essay, Adorno has not yet come to appreciate the specific relevance of Marx's critique of political economy to capitalism. Thus, in the pages of the essay, Adorno can only master his self-imposed program in a superficial sense, namely by watering down both the Marxian and Freudian concepts of fetishism. Among other places, this can be seen in Adorno's reference to society's, quote, automobile religion, end quote. Adorno. Here, the invocation of a discourse on industrial societies, fetishization of cars, suggests that Adorno's concept of fetishism corresponds not to a technical usage of the term, but rather to a common one, a usage no doubt indebted to a vulgarized version of Freud's concept of fetish, which Freud himself fashioned out of what was originally a religious concept, yet one whose meaning is already quite distinct from Freud's, let alone from Marx's. Footnote. Freud's first mention of the concept of fetishism is in 1905 is accompanied by the following description, quote, "The substitute for the sexual object is some part of the body, such as the foot or hair, which is generally hardly appropriate for sexual purposes, or it is some inanimate object in some demonstrable relation to the person whom it replaces, and preferably to that person's sexuality, e.g. items of clothing or underwear," end quote. Freud. End footnote. Footnote. A revealing misunderstanding can be seen in a text from the 1970s, in which an ostentatious car, its decadent appearance, and a nefarious capitalist meld together into a nexus of manipulation referred to as, quote, fetishism, end quote. Quote, in the fetishism of the sports car owner, as aptly as psychoanalytic categories may describe it, no small role is played by the fetishism fermented by capital owners with the exchange value of commodities, that is, with the appearance abstracted from the material and with the simulated beauty, end quote. Kreimeier, 1971. This passage simply has nothing to do with Marx's fetish character of commodities. End footnote. Tellingly, even when Adorno professes what Schmidt-Neuer describes as a, quote, pronounced libidinal relationship, end quote, to his own text in a letter to a Horkheimer concerning potential changes to the summary of the On Jazz article, it is still apparent that his concept of fetishism owes far less to Marx and psychoanalysis than to popular discourse. When Adorno writes to Horkheimer that, quote, my fetishism only applies to the grand German text, not the summaries, end quote, it is difficult to interpret him as referencing Marx's fetish character of the commodity form or wanting to diagnose himself with a psychopathology. Rather, Adorno's particular use of the concept of fetishism here can be seen as illustrating a point he would subsequently make in 1954, not without unintentional irony, regarding the use of psychological concepts. Quote, as soon as one removes concepts from the theoretical context in which those concepts' meaning is rooted and reduces them to the level of alleged common sense, they change their meaning and no longer achieve their formerly intended purpose. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. In the essay's republication, Adorno does in fact considerably qualify the relevance of psychoanalysis to a critical portrayal of the fetish character in music. In this updated version, the thesis that the fetishism of music entails a regression of listening is followed by the explanation that this regression, quote, does not mean a relapse of the individual listener into an earlier phase of his own development, nor a decline in the collective general level, since the millions who are reached musically for the first time by today's mass communications cannot be compared with the audience of the past. Rather, it is contemporary listening which is regressed, addressed it at the infantile stage, end quote. Adorno. In all but two places, the term, quote, lust, end quote, or, quote, pleasure, end quote, is replaced with the softer term, quote, genus, end quote, enjoyment, or simply removed. End footnote. Adorno's understanding of fetishism is in the mid-1930s is further exemplified by his concept of, quote, vocal fetishism, end quote. In a letter to Horkheimer from the 28th of November 1936, Adorno mentions his intention to investigate the, quote, valuation of, quote, beautiful voices, end quote, as commodities, end quote, in the Fetish Character article, which at the time was still in its planning stages. Ultimately, the essay would read as follows, quote, wait, hold on. There's a footnote that I missed. Footnote. Quote, productive critique should be applied through the directional tendency of the work to the reigning culinary ideas, especially to vocal fetishism. In doing so, one touches upon what is probably the trickiest point of the opera problematic. That opera listeners are interested in voices is also legitimate. Through the voice, living humans engage with music in the most immediate sense, ... Yet one should not content oneself with voice, should not elevate voice to an end in itself. Something of its inherent right must also be preserved in its shaping through musical intention. But through its specific qualities, it must ultimately serve music as an instrument. As a higher understanding of opera instructs, the voice should be appreciated in the voice's musical function, end quote. Adorno. The term vocal fetishism also occurs in Adorno 2006d. The same text also contains the following note, quote, songs. Songs are almost always presented at much too slow a tempo because singers want to display their voices and give expression, often at the music's expense, end quote. Adorno. As opposed to this, Adorno argues that music, quote, must be allowed to linger, but not to listen to itself, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Ultimately, the Fetish Character essay would read as follows, quote, at its most passionate, musical fetishism takes possession of the public valuation of singing voices. Their sensuous magic is traditional, as is the close relation between success and the person endowed with, quote, material, end quote. But today it is forgotten that it is material. For musical vulgar materialists, it is synonymous with to have a voice and to be a singer. In earlier epochs, technical virtuosity, at least, was demanded of singing stats, the castrati and prima donnas. Today, the material as such, destitute of any function, is celebrated. One need not even ask about capacity for musical performance. Even mechanical control of the instrument is no longer really expected. To legitimize the fame of its owner, a voice need only be especially voluminous or especially high. If one dares even in conversation to question the decisive importance of the voice, and to assert that it is just as possible to make beautiful music with a moderately good voice as it is on a moderately good piano, one will immediately find oneself faced with a situation of hostility and aversion, whose emotional roots go far deeper than the occasion. Voices are holy properties like a national factory trademark, end quote. Adorno. Adorno draws an analogy between singing voices and, quote, factory brands, end quote. Fabrikmarken, or, quote, commodity brands, end quote. Warenmarken. That is, commodities, in order to articulate the objective inadequacy of the absolutist view of singing voices promoted by commodity fetishism. Footnote. Quote, if success today does in fact demand the commodity mark of the emotional type, this reveals nothing about musical thinking in particular, rather it says something about the prevailing enterprise, end quote. Adorno. According to Adorno, concert goers who hold this view do not perceive voice as an instrument performing the particular content of a particular piece, but rather measure voice out of context against an idealized, quote, absolute, end quote, voice. Footnote. Along these lines, Adorno writes elsewhere that, quote, if you say from the musical point of view, for example, that even in opera, beautiful voices are means of presenting the composition rather than ends in themselves, you will be answered in a tone of outrage out of all proportion to the rational gist of the controversy. The study of such outbursts and of their psychogenesis promises more insights into the function of musical activities in the psychological household of society than will result from inquiries about immediate likes or dislikes, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Footnote. In the book, Introduction to the Sociology of Music, Adorno speaks of the archetype of the, quote, culture consumer, end quote, who, quote, lies in wait for specific elements, for supposedly beautiful melodies, for grandiose moments, end quote. Adorno. As Adorno continues, a certain tentativeness emerges in his use of the concept of fetishism. Quote, on the whole, his relation to music has a fetishistic touch. The standard he consumes by is the prominence of the consumed. The joy of the composition, of that which in his language music, quote, gives, end quote, to him, outweighs his enjoyment of the music itself as a work of art that makes demands on him. 2 or 3 generations ago, this type used to pose as a Wagnerian. Today, he is more likely to call Wagner names. At a violinist concert, his interest will focus on what he calls, quote, tone production, quote, if not indeed on the violin itself. In a singer's case, it is the voice that interests this type. In a pianist, it may be the tuning of the grand. Such people are appraisers. The one thing they primarily respond to is an exorbitant and, so to speak, measurable performance breakneck virtuosity. For instance, wholly in the sense of the, quote, show ideal. Technique, the means, impresses them as an end in itself. In this respect, they are quite close to the presently widespread mass audience. End quote. Adorno. End footnote. In this way, voice is, quote, torn away from all functions which could give voice meaning, end quote. Adorno. The audience in turn judges the quality of a voice solely by a voice's virtuosity, as if this were a value in itself, and the quality of a musical composition by its success. However, while it may be true that, quote, the ever more senselessly cutthroat competition between ... the most marketable voices, end quote, transforms voices from means to an end into an end in itself, to identify every quid pro quo as an expression of commodity fetishism is to use the concept of fetishism as, quote, the left's prestige catch-all term of abuse, end quote. Henscheid, end quote. And indeed is precisely this kind of conceptual watering down in which, quote, many of the well-known misinterpretations and overinterpretations of commodity fetishism ... have their origin, end quote. Christoph Hesse. Not only in Adorno's work, but in Marxist literature in general. Footnote. Just how trivial the use of the Marxian concept of fetishism has become is demonstrated by an anecdote from the not quite scholarly literature on the subject. In his work, Kennen Sie Marx? Do You Know Marx? The philosopher Günther Schulte uses a, quote, splendor of analogy intention, end quote. Analogie Nungspracht, combining Talmudic exegesis with thoroughly vulgarized psychoanalysis to arrive at an exceedingly unique interpretation of Marx's fetish character, drawing a comparison between the figure of Lilith in the Jewish mythological tradition, Adam's first wife, and the Marxian image of the inverted table from the, quote, fetish chapter in Capital, Günther Schulte argues in short that Marx, as someone allegedly familiar with the Talmud, envisions with his table metaphor nothing other than the image of Lilith, the quote, bearer of desire and undoing, end quote. After all, according to mythology, Lilith, quote, turned the table, end quote. That is, herself during sex with Adam, quote, around, end quote. As the author graphically depicts with his own handmade drawings, the naked woman, turned around on all fours, presents herself, voila, as a fetish. It's like a weird, as a quote, fetish, end quote. Translator's note: this is a play on the German words for table, tisch, and fetish. Fetish. Yeah, it's a weird thing. It's like a F-E, capital F-E, no, capital F, lowercase e, capital T, I-S-C-H. So, end footnote. At times it seems that practically everything disagreeable can be written off as fetishism. In self-professed Marxist literature, references can be found to, quote, equality fetishism, quote, market fetishism, quote, party fetishism, quote, plan fetishism, quote, council fetishism, quote, immediacy fetishism, quote, object fetishism, quote, position fetishism, quote, praxis fetishism, quote, science fetishism, quote, balance fetishism, quote, legality fetishism, quote, clerical fetishism, quote, data fetishism, quote, facts, end quote, fetishism, end quote, document fetishism, end quote, costuming fetishism, end quote, and so on, tracing these, quote, fetishisms, end quote, back to the argumentation generating them, an argumentation which ultimately always says that, quote, fetishism, end quote, is the basis of an inversion of means and ends, the mistaken positioning of a being in itself. One would have to diagnose a, quote, fetishism, end quote. Quote, the most stubborn of all fetishizations appears to be the overestimation of the concept of fetish, end quote. Footnote. The fetishism identified here are located in Trenkel, 1992, Trampert, 2002, Wolf, 1999, Kurtz, 1987, Dove, 2002, Wenzel and Amsel, 1997, Schenk, 1992, Schandl, 2001, Liesmann, 2003, Gross, 2003, Zadamach, 2003, Niemann, 1999, Lange, 1978, Stock, 1996, Helms, Konzett, and Knab, 1999, Hoffman, 1999, Schutzrumpf, 2008. I don't know who all those people are, but Trenkel and Kurtz I know are from like the Crisis School. Dove, of course, is a communization guy. And I think Schutzrumpf is like a scholar on Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. I'm not exactly sure, though. End footnote. Tracing these, quote, fetishisms, end quote, back to the argumentation generating them, an argumentation which ultimately always says that, quote, fetishism, end quote, is the basis of an inversion of means and ends, the mistaken position of a being in itself. One would have to diagnose a, quote, fetishism, end quote. Quote, the most stubborn of all fetishizations appears to be the overestimation of the concept of fetish, end quote. I already said that. But that last quote is from a Erkenbrecht, 1976. In addition to the commodity fetish, Adorno views the category of success as another mediating economic element in the production and consumption of music. Quote, Marx defines the fetish character of the commodity as the veneration of the thing made by oneself, which, as exchange value, simultaneously alienates itself from producer to consumer, quote, human beings, end quote. Quote, a commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in a commodity, the social character of men's labor appears to men as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their labor power is presented to them as a social relation existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor, end quote. This is the real secret of success, is the mere reflection of what one pays in the market for the product. The consumer is really worshipping the money that he himself has paid for the ticket to the Toscanini concert. He has literally, quote, made, end quote, the success which he reifies and accepts as an objective criterion, without recognizing himself in it. He is not, quote, made, end quote, it by liking the concert, but rather by buying the ticket, end quote. Adorno. And the quote in the middle of the quote was from Marx. Thus, according to Adorno, success no longer depends on objective factors relating to musicians, ability, performance, talent, etc., but instead on the consumers of musical products, who alone determine the success of producers. While musicians produce music, consumers produce success. At the same time, consumers fail to recognize the social character of this success they, quote, achieve, which appears to them in a reified form, bearing no trace of origin in human labor. In this way, humans are alienated from themselves, no longer able to perceive the results of their actions as such. Against Adorno's attempt to analyze commodity fetishism sociologically, one might object that the passage Adorno cites from Marx refers to the products of labor, and that the acquisition of a concert ticket does not constitute labor in the Marxian sense. In other words, while Marx's work already characterizes the concept of freedom as mere, quote, In other words, while Marx's work already characterizes the concept of fetishism as mere, quote, analogy, end quote, Adorno analogizes the concept of fetishism yet again. Footnote. Adorno's library contains a copy of an edition of the first volume of Capital, edited by Hans Joachim Lieber and Peter Furt. The fourth volume of the collection, Karl Marx, Werke, Schriften, Briefe, edited by Hans Joachim Lieber and Benedikt Kautsky, and published by Kota in Stuttgart. The only sign of it having been read is an underlining of the word, quote, analogy, in the famous sentence from the fetish chapter, quote, in order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must take flight into the misty realm of religion, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Also problematic is Adorno's assumption that the fetish character of the commodity is the expression of a falsehood per se. After all, according to Marx, it is precisely under existing capitalist conditions that the commodity's fetish character is not false. Quote, that bracket individuals and bracket social relationship to one another appears as a social relationship between things is ... not at all an illusion, end quote. Heinrich. Rather, to individuals as producers, the, quote, social relation between their private labors appears as what they are. Appears as what they are, end quote. Marx. The fetish character of the commodity pertains to the, quote, commodity itself as a form of relations, not a set of relations, quote, behind, end quote, the commodity, unquote. Pastone. Without a doubt, Adorno's understanding of commodity fetishism is problematic and worthy of critique from the perspective of the Marxian concept. At the same time, Adorno's description of the commodity's fetish character as the, quote, veneration of the thing made by oneself, end quote, is the genesis of a constantly recurring element of Adorno's philosophy. The, quote, veneration of the thing made by oneself, end quote, that is the religiously overinflated worship of the non-natural. How Adorno wants to understand the fetish character is for Adorno the expression of the contemporary treatment of cultural products of all kinds, from autonomous works of art to the most insipid popular music. Quote, deluded, man sets up something artificial as a primal phenomenon and prays to it, an authentic instance of fetishism, end quote. Adorno. There's a footnote that I missed. Footnote. It is not unlikely that Adorno borrowed the term, quote, veneration, end quote, which is highly uncommon in German, from the following passage in Kierkegaard's Either Or. Quote, the individual rests with confident security in the assurance that his life is ethically structured, and therefore the individual does not torment himself and others with quibbling anxiety about this or that. I find it quite in order that the person who lives ethically as a whole territory for inconsequentials, and being unwilling to force it into every triviality, is precisely a veneration for the ethical, end quote. Kierkegaard. End footnote. The artwork, quote, a man-made social product, end quote, is thereby transfigured into a, quote, in itself, end quote, even while the immediate datum itself is inherently mediated, end quote. Adorno. Against this fetishism, quote, art as a consumer commodity, end quote, is actually, quote, a corrective, end quote, insofar as it is, quote, appraised, according to the consistent exchange principle, which values any being as, quote, for something else, end quote, end quote. Adorno. The fetishism which adheres to artworks cannot be criticized or transcended abstractly, as, quote, the truth of all artworks would, on the other hand, not exist without the fetishism that now verges on becoming art's untruth. The quality of artworks depends essentially on the degree of their fetishism, on the veneration that the process of production pays to what lays claim to being self-produced, to the seriousness that forgets the pleasure taken in it. Only through fetishism, the blinding of the artwork vis-a-vis the reality of which the artwork is part, does the work transcend the spell of the reality principle as something spiritual. End quote. Adorno. Although the art commodity, which is solely a commodity, quote, produces its own pretense of immediacy and intimacy, end quote, the autonomous artwork which elicits from the pseudo-sophisticate the classic response that he, quote, cannot understand modern art, end quote, also refuses to appear immediately accessible to the more generous recipient. Quote, taste is the ability to keep in balance the contradiction in art between the made and the apparent not having become. True works of art, however, never at one with taste, are those which push this contradiction to the extreme and realize themselves in the resultant downfall, end quote. Adorno. This fetishization, quote, expresses the paradox of all art that is no longer self-evident to itself. The paradox that something made exists for its own sake. Precisely this paradox is the vital nerve of new art. By exigency, the new must be something willed, as what is other. However, it could not be what was willed, end quote. Adorno. Quote, autonomy and fetishism are two sides of the same truth, end quote. Adorno. Not long before writing the article on the fetish character in music and the regression of listening, Adorno warned Benjamin that, quote, the conception of the commodity fetish must be documented with appropriate passages from the man who discovered it, end quote. Adorno. However, through a productive misunderstanding, Adorno's own essay transforms the concept of fetishism into one which describes the reception of artworks under conditions relating to the dominant mode of production. Sorry for that little gapsy poo. My phone was dying. Section 3Z poo is titled Pure Use Value. According to Adorno, when the importance of music's quality is supplanted by music's economic success, when music's social function is dependent on sales and profit, then it indeed follows that music itself must be viewed as a commodity. As Adorno writes in the original version of the fetish character essay from the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, quote, the application of the category of the commodity to music is not an analogy. Yes, the exchange of, quote, cultural goods, end quote. However, it occurs, terminates in material matters, opera and concert tickets, piano compositions of popular songs, gramophone records, radio sets, and especially in America, articles advertised with the aid of musical executions. End quote. Adorno. Although Adorno's earlier work on the social situation of music echoes the view expressed in his habilitation on Kierkegaard that it is possible for commodities to exist which have been, quote, deprived of their own use value, end quote. Quote, the fetish character article appears to revise this position. Quote, to be sure, exchange value exerts exchange value's power in a special way in the realm of cultural goods. For in the world of commodities, this realm appears to be exempted from the power of exchange, to be in an immediate relationship with the goods, and it is this appearance in turn which alone gives cultural goods their exchange value. But they nevertheless simultaneously fall completely into the world of commodities, are produced for the market, and are aimed at the market. The appearance of immediacy is as strong as the compulsion of exchange value is inexorable. The social impact harmonizes the contradiction. The appearance of immediacy takes possession of the mediated, exchange value itself. If the commodity in general combines exchange value and use value, then the pure use value, whose illusion the cultural goods must preserve in completely capitalist society, must be replaced by pure exchange value, which precisely in its capacity as exchange value deceptively takes over the function of use value. The specific fetish character of music lies in this quid pro quo. The feelings which go to the exchange value create the appearance of immediacy, at the same time as the absence of a relation to the object belies it. It has its basis in the abstract character of exchange value. Every, quote, psychological, end quote, aspect, every ersatz satisfaction depends on such social substitution. End quote. Adorno. In this way, Adorno continues, quote, the appearance of exchange value in commodities has taken on a specific cohesive function, end quote. Adorno. Although it is acknowledged here that commodities have exchange value and use value, Adorno still continues to regard use value as a condition of possibility for the pleasure music offers listeners. Use value is conceptualized as where the, quote, feelings, end quote, would have to go if only it were not, quote, replaced by pure exchange value, end quote. Using cultural phenomena such as music, among others, Adorno attempts to provide an exemplary illustration of a historic situation of inversion between use value and exchange value. Quote, the more inexorably the principle of exchange value destroys use values for human beings, the more deeply does exchange value disguise exchange value's self as the object of enjoyment, bracket, or object of pleasure according to the 1938 version of the essay, end bracket, end quote. Adorno. Yet if use value were indeed destroyed, quote, for human beings, end quote, music would no longer be a commodity in the Marxian sense, according to which a commodity without use value cannot exist. On the other hand, if music is a commodity, if it does have a use value, then it is not clear why the recipients of music, that is, the consumers of the commodity of music, would not consume this commodity by consuming its use value, as is the case with every other commodity. Adorno claims that, quote, the woman who has money with which to buy is intoxicated by the act of buying, end quote. Adorno. While this statement may be true, this statement does not describe a genuinely economic phenomenon. It is not exchange value which, quote, the woman, end quote, enjoys, but rather, if anything, the prestige she acquires from the commodity or the commodity's purchase, or it is the pastime of shopping she enjoys, or the real or imagined sense of, quote, Dabeisein, end quote, of being present or a participant in a crowd of consumers, as Adorno himself notes immediately thereafter, quote, in the American conventional speech, having a good time means being present at the enjoyment of others, which in its turn has as its only content being present, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, having a good time, end quote, written in English in the German version, end footnote. Here Adorno invokes a situation which appears to him as the unfortunate rule in what he describes elsewhere as, quote, Toscanini's America, end quote. Footnote. In their early days, American radio stations, quote, founded their own symphonic orchestras out of artistic and practical considerations. When the New York Symphony Orchestra dissolved, its director, Walter Damrosch, founded the NBC Symphony Orchestra in 1927. In 1937, the NBC Symphony Orchestra was newly organized and entrusted to the 70-year-old Arturo Toscanini. For 16 and a half years, Arturo Toscanini remained the leader of this outstanding musical body, end quote. Mattfeld, 1996. End footnote. 1966. End footnote. Seeing in Toscanini's, quote, music making, a, quote, dreadful streamline, end quote, Adorno identifies, quote, streamlining, end quote, as the, quote, fetishism of smooth functioning without musical sense and construction, ... Functioning comes to replace function, end quote. Adorno. Just as Dabeisein comes to replace participation, functioning and Dabeisein, detached from any substance, exist merely for their own sake. Footnote. Elsewhere, Adorno writes of the, quote, illusion of, quote, being with, end quote, bracket, of Dabeisein, end bracket, no matter what, end quote, end footnote. Although the quid pro quo which Adorno evokes in another example, also invoking, quote, women, quote, in moments of intimacy, women attach greater importance to the hairdressers and cosmeticians than to the situation for the sake of which the hairdressers and cosmeticians are employed, end quote, does describe an inversion of means and ends, It does not describe an inversion of use value and exchange value. Here, attentiveness in Adorno's approach to commodity analysis reveals itself. When Adorno remarks that the exchange value of cultural goods, quote, exerts its power in a special way, end quote, because these goods take on the, quote, appearance of immediacy, end quote, Adorno fails to recognize that it is precisely this appearance which Marx attempts to capture with his concept of the commodities fetish character. By Marx's definition, every commodity has a corresponding fetish character, not simply those to which an immediacy is ascribed externally and possibly for cultural reasons, such as music. Once music has become a commodity, it has the same immediacy as any other profane commodity, namely an immediacy in appearance only. Therefore, it is not the appearance of immediacy, quote, which alone gives cultural goods their exchange value, end quote. This appearance of immediacy is the result of the commodity form of cultural goods, that is logically preceded by their exchange value. Rather, once again, as is the case with every commodity, cultural goods gain their exchange value from the way in which they are produced. The insight that economic value, and hence also exchange value, is not imposed on a commodity by ideology, but rather emerges objectively in the production of commodities, is the core of the Marxian labor theory of value. Although Adorno does write that, quote, the commodity in general combines exchange value and use value, end quote, Adorno overlooks that both forms of value have their origins in capitalist production. And as a consequence of this misunderstanding of the economic essence of use value acts in, quote, use value acts in the fetish character article as the arbiter of immediacy and authenticity. Yet in reality, if use value is merely the precondition for commodities to be able to be consumed at all, even in a way which is regarded as, quote, false, then it is precisely use value, which is not, quote, destroyed, end quote, for human beings. And the claim that exchange value, quote, deceptively takes over the function of use value, end quote, is false. Both use value and exchange value have fixed economic functions independent of the psychology of subjects. While it is entirely possible that, quote, every pleasure which emancipates itself from exchange value takes on subversive features, end quote, emancipation from exchange value would necessarily also be emancipation from use value, that is, from commodities altogether, and this would mean from capitalism entirely. Writing to Benjamin about the fetish character article, Adorno expresses his particular eagerness to hear Benjamin's, quote, response to the theory that today exchange value itself is being consumed. The tension between this theory and your own concerning the buyer's empathy with the soul of the commodity could prove to be a very fruitful one, end quote. Adorno to Benjamin, 10th of November 1938. Agreeing in his reply with Adorno's remark that the essay, quote, certainly bears the marks of haste in composition, but perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing, end quote, Benjamin compares his own first essay on Baudelaire with Adorno's work. Quote, basically, however, empathy with the commodity is probably empathy with exchange value itself. And in fact, one can hardly imagine the, quote, consumption, end quote, of exchange value as anything else but an empathy with exchange value. You write, quote, the consumer really worships the money which the consumer has spent on a ticket for a Toscanini concert, end quote. Empathy with exchange value can turn guns into articles of consumption more attractive than butter. When, in popular parlance, someone is said to be, quote, loaded to the tune of 5 million, end quote, then the entire national community also feels itself loaded with millions more, and it empathizes with those millions, end quote. Benjamin. Letter from Benjamin to Adorno, 9th of December, 1938. Adorno responds with reservation, quote, it does still seem to me that the concept of empathy with inorganic matter does not provide the decisive resources. Of course, one is treading on extremely delicate ground here, particularly as far as the journal is concerned, since a kind of absolute Marxist competence is rightly postulated for every claim that is made. I have now reformulated my own position concerning the substitution of exchange value with enormous effort and the assistance of Marx, as compared with its rather more audacious version in the first draft. End quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 1st of February 1938. New section, section 4, blank spaces in the mediation. Adorno did not have to wait long for criticism of the fetish character article to arrive. On the 23rd of January 1939, Hans Meyer, a Marxist literary scholar in contact with the Institute for Social Research at the time, sent Horkheimer an essay titled Remarks on a Critical Music Theory, Bemerkungen zu einer kritischen Musiktheorie. First, this essay sharply criticizes Adorno's inadequate use of economic categories. Quote, Adorno chose as the foundation of his analysis, and signaled as much with the title of his work, the famous concept of commodity fetishism, which was developed by Marx to inquire into the secret of the commodity form, and later expanded by Lukács in his famous considerations of the problem of, quote, reification, and then applied to the formation of consciousness. Yet everything depends on whether this category is well chosen in the present case, or whether it is, quote, fruitful, end quote, end quote. Hans Meyer. Meyer forthrightly concludes that it is not. According to Meyer, the fetish character article takes, quote, formulations such as, quote, reification and, quote, fetishism, which are gradually becoming catchwords, end quote, out of the context of Marx's Capital, only to place them, quote, anywhere at random, end quote. Hans Meyer. Ultimately, he argues, Adorno's, quote, reading of Capital appears to be limited to familiarity with its first chapter on the secret of the commodity form, end quote. Meyer. This criticism must have struck a nerve. While Adorno's essay claims to introduce Marxian categories into the analysis of the reception of music, nowhere in its discussion of the categories of commodity, use value, exchange value, and fetishism does it pose the question of the specific form of socialization, the very question which leads Marx to attend to these categories in the first place. Meyer does not take long to address the, quote, substitution of use value by exchange value. Meyer does not take long to address the, quote, substitution, end quote, of use value by exchange value, end quote, alleged by Adorno. Quote, one is first puzzled by the use of the economic categories of use value and exchange value, and then specifically one learns that, quote, the application of the category of commodity to music is not, end quote, supposed to be, quote, merely an analogy, end quote. That is, when one learns that these categories are supposed to be understood literally. Here the objections arise immediately. First and foremost, there is the unfortunate use of the term use value as a description of the specifically musical values of a tonal work, and thus as the opposite of the character of exchange value, which accumulated success has. Use value, that is, the use value of a commodity, is by nature an economic category. In this respect, it by no means stands opposed to exchange value, another economic category. End quote. Hans Meyer. Although Marx describes use value as the opposite of value in Capital, This dichotomy is intra-economic. Quote, therefore, the concept of use value can only be applied to an economic approach. ... Outside the economic sphere, the concept of use value loses all meaning. This is particularly true in the present case, as an ostensible description of the genuine musical artistic substance of Schubert's B minor symphony, and an attempt to show that this source of value is increasingly repressed by the numbers hype around the, quote, unfinished, end quote. Unfinished being capitalized. I guess that's a piece. The social phenomenon is accurately described, but the social phenomenon's construal in the formulation, quote, substitution of use value by exchange value, end quote, is clumsy. There is no, quote, use value, end quote, in this sphere. What could appear as such, namely the, quote, marketability, end quote, of this symphony that Chopin etude, has nothing to do with musical value. Marketability is also not suppressed by, quote, exchange value, end quote, but rather is a part of this realm, the sphere of the quantitative, of measurable success, end quote. Hans Meyer. Adorno writes that, quote, the world of music, end quote, which extends, quote, to Schubert's B minor symphony, labeled the unfinished, is one of fetishes, end quote. Adorno. The allegedly unfinished symphony is Schubert's seventh from 1822. End footnote. Meyer recognizes clearly that the Marxian designations of exchange value and use value as respectively quantitative and qualitative elements of the definitionally economic category, quote, commodity, are not observed in Adorno's work. Given this ambiguity, Meyer criticizes Adorno for failing to provide evidence, quote, that all of his examples deal with more than analogies. If it is true that the laws of commodity production also directly generate and shape the world of contemporary musical life in all its manifestations, then Adorno has at least failed to provide us with concrete evidence of the mediations which produce such relations between the economic and musical spheres, end quote. Hans Meyer. As a consequence, quote, instead of concrete mediations, a somewhat homely economism is given, end quote. Meyer. Quote, the problem bursts, ... the framework of purely economic categories, end quote. Meyer. Following Meyer's critique, Adorno himself drafted a memorandum titled Notizen zu Meyer, Notes to Meyer, which Horkheimer used to compose his response letter to Meyer, partially quoting it verbatim. In this memorandum, Adorno attempts once again to defend his analysis of the present state of music with Marxian categories. Quote, paramount among Meyer's theoretical objections is the claim that I haphazardly isolated out the fetish chapter of capital, or the antithesis of use value and exchange value, thereby producing a rigid musical sociological schema which disregards with other important motifs of Marxian analysis, and particularly the theory of circulation. As far as the Marxist question is concerned, I would just like to note that I do not in fact believe that the analysis of the commodity form in Marx's work is simply one among a number of equally important motifs, what a pluralist sociologist would believe. Rather, what I believe is that the category of the commodity is indeed the category which illuminates the entire realm of Marxism like a headlamp. Horkheimer himself recently went so far as to illustrate the concept of ideology with the capitalist who, for reasons of necessary social appearance, attributes surplus value not merely to variable capital, but also to constant capital, that is, to congealed rather than living labor. At heart, this motif is identical with the critique of reification, and I believe it would not be difficult to show that Capital, the book, is dominated down to the most intimate economic details, for example, the theory of the falling rate of profit, by the theory of reification, which has a precisely defined economic meaning, end quote. Adorno, Notizen zu Meyer. Here, Adorno refers to a comment made by Horkheimer in a discussion between the two on the 3rd of February 1939, shortly before Adorno drafted his memorandum on Meyer's letter. In this discussion, Horkheimer, quote, expresses the economic formulation of the objective origin of ideology as one of necessary appearance. By virtue of his social position, the entrepreneur must be of conviction that the social surplus has come from constant capital and not merely from variable capital, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. There's a footnote that I missed here. It says the chapter in Capital on the rate of surplus value. Quote, the capital is made up of two components. One of the sum of money, C, constant capital, laid out on means of production, and the other sum of money, V, variable capital, expended upon labor power. Constant capital represents the portion of value which has been turned into constant capital. And so he's just using the letters here. So V that turned into variable capital, end quote, end quote. Adorno continues, quote, therefore, by focusing on these concepts, I believe I am not following a fetishistic whim or Lukash's example, but rather the spirit of the Marxist method myself. I would claim the same for the other point on which Mayer accuses me of obstinacy, namely for starting from production. To start principally from circulation would immediately summon the danger of precisely the very psychologism which the work opposes in principle. This is the same consideration which determines the particular stance of my work on the problem of mediation. I am quite well aware of the demand for economic mediation. Equally so, I am aware of the immense difficulties standing in its way. However, replacing it with an intellectual historical demand of the kind Mayer suggests would mean regressing from the entire approach and taking up psychological historical explanations where political economy does not deliver. I, for one, would rather leave the blank spaces in the mediation like white spots on a map and pose the problem firmly as an objectively social one. End quote. Adorno. Notizen zu Meyer. Or Mayer. No, it's Mayer. Sorry, I don't know why I keep saying Meyer. To make his thesis of the substitution of use value by exchange value more precise, Adorno again invokes his postulation of the phenomenon of, quote, vocal fetishism, end quote. While Adorno claims that, quote, the cult of the voice, of mere virtuosity, of incursion, of the so-called sensuous harmony, and any manner of similar things are unique to the entire epoch of developed bourgeois music dating at least as far back as the middle of the 19th century, end quote. He believes it should be noted that, quote, There has been a decisive change today insofar as these elements are no longer even enjoyed anymore. I almost want to say no longer even perceived. Rather, it is actually their mere reflection in prevailing enterprise which is perceived and enjoyed. What is decisive for the contemporary state of affairs is not externality or superficiality, nor is it even the old-fashioned worship of success, but rather the very process of substitution which I attempt to describe with the thesis that exchange value is consumed in place of use value. I have the impression that Herr Mayer does not see the real scope of this thesis, but rather constantly reduces it to much more harmless older phenomena. Although these may be, quote, the same, end quote, in a certain sense, they are entirely different in another, namely in the sense of totality, of the alteration of the individual by a totality of commodities, between which there is no choice, and to which deep down there is no longer even any relationship. While all of these elements used to contribute to a progressive tendency, today they serve a regressive one. This is because they are not really even themselves anymore, but rather only the stylistic reflection of themselves, and also because the highlights that they allegedly bring today are actually reducible to their entirely abstract exchange value. To emphasize this idea, I prefaced my work by examining the concept of musical taste and music and its liquidation. I thought that the rest of the work made it clear enough. End quote. Adorno, Notes on Mayer. In other words, Adorno maintains that consumers desire things not for their inherent worth, but rather because they are viewed as valuable in a non-economic sense by the general public. However, this has an effect on the economy of things, which is why commodities do in fact have a mediating function between individuals. Although essentially social rather than economic by nature, this function appears to belong to commodities themselves. A particular commodity confers a particular prestige, which can be acquired through its purchase. Concluding by addressing the, quote, purely economic categories, end quote, decried by Mayer, Adorno claims to be misunderstood by the former insofar as he, quote, views the meaning of economic categories in the framework of Marxist theory as specifically limited to economic science. He believes that this meaning must be, quote, mediated by categories from other sciences, whereas the essence of the Marxist method is precisely to turn to the process of production itself in order to dismantle all the obfuscations reflected in other bourgeois sciences' concepts of mediation. If my work has a fundamental deficiency, it is that my work is not economic enough. That is, that the economic categories used in my work are insufficiently distinguished as such to achieve what they are burdened with, ... If Herr Mayer sensed something of this deficiency, he certainly interprets it backwards, which is to say, he believes that this distinction can be reached through the introduction of non-economic categories, whereas in truth only the ongoing distinction of the economic categories themselves would have the power to dismantle the intellectual historical blanket concepts, among which I must of course count his concept of the historical, end quote. Adorno. Adorno argues that the mediations demanded by Mayer are all already present given that music is produced as a commodity. Whoever recognizes this can use Marx to explore the status of music as a commodity in existing society. Far more problematic is Adorno's critique of a, quote, commodity listening, end quote, to which serious music is sold out, quote, for the price of its wages, end quote. Even if this characteristic of the reception of music is supposed to be purely descriptive, see for example when Adorno writes of, quote, ears trained, bracket, in commodity listening, end bracket, end quote. In his monograph on Mahler, one might ask which mediations determine the difference in reception of a piece of music, depending on whether or not it was produced as a commodity. Whatever these mediations may be, it is hardly conceivable that they would be economic in nature. Having received from Horkheimer the response prepared by Adorno to his objections, Mayer again inquires about the, quote, concrete mediations, end quote, in another letter, quote, "It was never my intention to deny the central importance of the problem of reification in the analysis of capitalist society. However, I do protest against a certain tendency which I thought I perceived in Adorno's work, namely, the tendency to separate the problem of commodity fetishism from the ensemble of capital, Marx's Capital, to absolutize and thus remain stuck in the first volume, instead of advancing to the, quote, process of capitalist production as a whole, end quote. Against me, it is objected that Adorno did not, quote, economize, end quote, too much, but rather too little. As paradoxical as it may appear to sound, to this I replied that this is precisely what I meant. The apparent contradiction is only a matter of differing uses of the word, quote, economic. If my critics agree, that Adorno's essay juxtaposes certain economic categories with corresponding, quote, superstructural, end quote, phenomena too abruptly and without accounting for the economic mediations in detail, this was precisely the core of my critique. I simply conceived of the term, quote, economic in a narrower sense, which I contrasted with the necessary, extremely nuanced Eros analysis. In its own right, this analysis admittedly struck me too, as by no means an amorphous stringing together of psychology plus sociology plus history, etc., or otherwise as pluralist, but rather as conceived strictly structurally around a central thesis. Objectively, I therefore see no difference here. Yet the fact remains that Adorno did not depict in detail the economic or socioeconomic process as a whole. The concrete mediations are missing. Whether this can be avoided given the manner in which he addresses the problems methodologically is another question. I still regard the application of the concept of, quote, use value to the material of the tonal work as inadequate and unproductive. This is not to say I am for an analysis which starts from the sphere of circulation. Yet here we arrive at the points where also still today, it seems to me, differences exist, end quote. Mayer. Letter from Mayer to Horkheimer, 23rd of April, 1939. Mayer later recalls that the debate was not carried on further. The lead up to and arrival of war meant that, quote, scholarly contacts between Europe and America could no longer be maintained, end quote. Looking back on the epistolary dispute, Mayer adopts a thoroughly conciliatory tone. Quote, at the time, there had already been an initial theoretical dispute between Adorno and myself. It started with a musical sociological analysis of the fetish character in music article and of the process of regression of listening, which Adorno had published in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung. While today I would describe this analysis as quite correct and prescient, I was embittered by it at the time and felt I had to identify a misunderstanding of facts in music theory and an absolutization of the positions of the Arnold Schoenberg school. Thus, I wrote an extensive counter-analysis in the form of a letter essay, which was followed by a theoretical counter-statement from the Institute for Social Research, drafted by Horkheimer and Adorno as a joint opinion. In it in turn accused my insistence on historical analysis of embodying the standpoint of historicism in intellectual history. End quote. Mayer. In the version of the fetish character article published in the essay collection Dissonanzen, the passage criticized by Mayer, which claims that, quote, application of the commodity category to music is not an analogy, end quote, is omitted. This prompts Wolfram Etta to speculate, quote, nothing could have possibly been less like Adorno than to assume an analogy between art and commodity. Art is commodity, hence the commodity character encompasses everything related to art, end quote. Wolfram Etta. In reality, quote, fetish character, the article, is not about an analogy, but rather, quote, a structural affinity based on the real relations of participation, that is, a homology which differs from analogy, precisely in the existence of a relation of participation. Thus it appears all the more puzzling that Adorno deleted the corresponding passage in the revision of the text. Perhaps the critique appeared graver in his memory than it actually was on this point. End quote. Wolfram Etta. However, it is more likely that Adorno would not agree with Etta's claim that although the, quote, totalitarian principle means a society as a whole and in all of its parts is composed according to the same principle, end quote, a, quote, mediation between these parts is absent, end quote. Wolfram Etta. Again, a totality whose elements do not do justice to their immediacy with the whole can only be misunderstood as analogy. The concept of totality states nothing more than, quote, the triviality that everything is linked with everything else, end quote, while saying, quote, nothing about the nature of the linkage, end quote. Remtsma, 1995. Adorno's retrospective also comes off as distant and self-critical when, in Adorno's lecture course titled Philosophical Elements of a Theory of Society, held 26 years later during the summer semester of 1964, Adorno concedes that his thesis that, quote, people do not only consume or attach themselves to use values, end quote, but rather, quote, are attached to exchange values, end quote, was, quote, perhaps not completely economically ironclad, end quote, Adorno. Likewise, Adorno admits that the essay's theory was, quote, developed somewhat blithely, especially because something like the enjoyment of exchange values can only truly be grasped socio-psychologically in terms of certain Freudian categories and is thus, strictly speaking, not actually social. So I am very much aware of the deficiencies of such a theory, end quote. Adorno. Adorno's estimation of his own thesis as, quote, blithe, end quote, here shows that he has realized the objective inadequacy of the way in which it uses Marxian terminology. Quote, I think that blithely begins afresh. Quote, a thinking that blithely begins afresh, heedless of the historic form of its problem, will so much more be their prey, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno identifies the ahistoricity of this ostensible, quote, beginning afresh, end quote, in, quote, blithely advancing positivism, end quote, as well. End footnote. Curiously, however, in Adorno's book Aesthetic Theory, a posthumously edited work which Adorno is not able to bring to completion himself, this exact thesis reappears. Quote, in monopoly capitalism, it is primarily exchange value, not use value, that is consumed, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, what might be called use value in the reception of cultural assets is being replaced by exchange value. Enjoyment is giving way to being there and being in the know. Connoisseurship by enhanced prestige, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. As to whether this passage was meant to be deleted or revised before the final draft, one can only speculate, yet it is certainly also possible that Adorno wanted to claim for himself that which he recognized both aphoristically It is also possible that Adorno wanted to claim for himself that which he recognized both aphoristically of psychology, where, quote, nothing is true except the exaggerations, end quote, as well as more generally, quote, only exaggeration per se today can be the medium of truth, end quote. Adorno. And that's the end of chapter 4. Thank you so much for listening.